3 months ago, if someone had told me that locking my garage door would lead to the complete collapse of our homeowners association, I would have called them crazy. But here I am, sitting in my car outside the Wellington Heights Community Center, watching through the windows as an emergency HOA meeting unfolds with only 8 of our 47 residents in attendance. The president's chair sits empty, and Karen Hendricks's signature red HOA polo shirt was found crumpled in the dumpster behind the building just this morning. The community bank account is missing $847,000. Karen's house has a bright yellow for sale sign planted in the perfectly manicured lawn that she used to patrol like a military checkpoint. Her phone goes straight to voicemail, and her social media accounts have vanished into thin air as if she never existed. The woman who once ruled our neighborhood with an iron fist and a laminated copy of the HOA bylaws has simply disappeared. I'm holding something in my hand that might explain everything. A single car key to a green Honda Civic. The same car that started this whole mess when I found it parked in my garage 3 months ago. The same car that Karen claimed she had every right to park wherever she pleased because, as she put it, I'm the HOA president, and I understand the rules better than you do. Well, Karen was wrong about a lot of things. But before I explain how a simple parking dispute brought down an entire sent its president fleeing into the night, I need to start from the beginning. It was a Sunday afternoon in late March when I returned from a 10-day business trip to Denver. I'd been working on expanding our pharmaceutical company's manufacturing facility, and I was exhausted, looking forward to nothing more than parking my BMW in my own garage and relaxing in my own home. Wellington Heights was one of those picture-perfect suburban neighborhoods where every lawn was precisely edged, and every mailbox painted the approved shade of forest green. My house was one of the larger ones, 4 bedrooms, a 2-car garage, and an 800-square-meter garden that I actually enjoyed maintaining. But as I pulled into my driveway that Sunday at 3 in the afternoon, I was greeted by a sight that made my blood pressure spike immediately. There, parked dead center in my garage, was a green Honda Civic that definitely didn't belong to me. The car was parked at such an awkward angle that it took up the entire space, with the front tire actually resting on the corner of my rubber floor mat. The driver's side door was slightly ajar, and I could smell the lingering odor of what seemed to be a tuna sandwich that had seen better days. On the dashboard, like some kind of medieval land claim, was a handwritten note that read, "Using temporarily, Karen H. President." I stood there for a full 5 minutes, staring at this Honda Civic like it was an alien spacecraft that had crash-landed in my personal space. My first instinct was to handle this like a reasonable adult. I called Karen's number, straight to voicemail. I sent her a text message asking her to move her car. No response. I even walked over to her house and knocked on the door, but the curtains were drawn tight, and there was no sign of life inside. Standing there in my own driveway, looking at my BMW X5 parked on the street like some kind of homeless vehicle, a different kind of thought entered my mind. Karen Hendricks had been HOA president for 18 months, and in that time, she'd made life miserable for half the neighborhood with her petty power trips and arbitrary rule enforcement. She'd fined residents for planting non-approved colors of flowers and threatened legal action against families for minor violations. And now, apparently, she thought she could just park in my garage because she felt like it. I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to play the role of the polite neighbor asking nicely for my property back, I decided to play by Karen's rules, If she wanted to use my garage without permission, then she could deal with the consequences. I got in my BMW, backed it out carefully around her Honda, and pulled it into my garage next to her car. Then I did something that I knew would drive Karen absolutely insane. I hit the button to close my garage door and listened to the satisfying click of the electronic lock engaging. Karen's car was now trapped inside my garage, and I was the only one with the remote control and access code to get it out. Within 6 hours, I had called my company and requested 3 weeks of vacation time. Fortunately, I had 18 accumulated days that I hadn't used. I booked a flight to London, leaving Monday morning, with connections to Paris and Rome. If Karen wanted to play games with other people's property, then she could figure out how to get her car back while I was sipping wine in a Tuscan vineyard. I turned off my phone's international roaming, packed a single suitcase, and went to bed with the most satisfying sense of justice I'd felt in months. Monday morning at 6 a.m., I drove to the airport with Karen's Honda still locked safely in my garage. My phone had already accumulated 23 missed calls and a string of increasingly frantic text messages. "Michael, open the garage right now! I need my car!" But I was already at 30,000 feet, watching Colorado disappear beneath the clouds, when Karen was probably discovering that her parking strategy had backfired spectacularly. For the first week in London and Paris, I lived in blissful ignorance of the chaos I'd left behind. I toured the British Museum, climbed the Eiffel Tower, and ate more croissants than any human should consume in a 7-day period. But during my second week in Rome, curiosity got the better of me, and I turned on my phone for the first time since leaving Denver. 247 text messages and 89 missed calls were waiting for me. Karen had sent 34 messages ranging from polite requests to outright threats about legal action. The messages from my neighbors painted a picture of escalating desperation. Margaret Thompson, a retired accountant, had sent me updates. Day 8, Karen called the police. They told her it's your private property and they can't do anything. David Miller, a real estate lawyer who lived nearby, reported, Day 10, Karen hired a professional lock-breaking company. Cost her $1,200. Still couldn't get in. The breakthrough came on day 14. Margaret sent me a message that made me laugh out loud while sitting in a Roman cafe. Michael, Karen found a way. She hired a metal cutting service to cut a small hole in the corner of your garage door. Cost her $1,200 for the cutting and welding repair. She finally got her car out, but your garage door has a patch job that looks terrible. Karen had spent over $2,000 and 2 weeks of frustration to retrieve her Honda Civic from my garage. But more importantly, she'd revealed something crucial about her character. She was willing to spend serious money just to prove a point about power and control. What Karen didn't know about me, what none of my neighbors knew, actually, was that I wasn't just some mild-mannered pharmaceutical company employee who happened to own a nice house in Wellington Heights. For 15 years before taking my current job as senior compliance officer, I had worked for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, known as FinCEN, which is part of the U.S. Treasury Department. My specialty was investigating financial fraud, money laundering, and embezzlement in non-profit organizations. I'd spent a decade and a half learning how to spot the warning signs of corruption, how to trace money through complex networks of shell companies, and how to build airtight cases against people who thought they were too smart to get caught. During my last week in Rome, as I read through the messages about Karen's desperate attempts to retrieve her car, I started noticing patterns that my old investigative instincts couldn't ignore. Why had Karen chosen to park her cheapest car in my garage when she had a 3-car garage of her own that housed a Mercedes C-Class and a Lexus SUV? And most importantly, how was someone making $65,000 a year as an insurance company administrator able to afford 2 luxury vehicles that she'd apparently paid for in cash? I began doing what I did best, following the money trail. Using my phone and the spotty Wi-Fi in my Rome hotel, I started accessing public records about Wellington Heights HOA finances. As a non-profit organization, the HOA was required to maintain transparent financial records, and what I found made my investigative blood start pumping for the first time in years. In the 18 months since Karen had become president, our monthly HOA fees had increased from $150 to $340 per household. That was more than a 100% increase, supposedly to cover essential maintenance and community improvements. But when I dug deeper into the expense reports, I found something that made my stomach turn. A company called Hendricks Home Services LLC had received $847,000 from the HOA in 18 months for emergency maintenance services. 23 different invoices, all approved by Karen without competitive bidding, all paid within days of being submitted. The company had been registered just 2 months after Karen became HOA president, and its business address was listed as 247 Maple Drive, which happened to be Karen's home address. Using techniques I'd learned for tracking shell companies and fraudulent contractors, I discovered that Karen had been systematically looting the HOA treasury. Email records showed that correspondence between Karen and Hendricks at gmail.com and hendrickshome@gmail.com came from the same IP address, often sent just minutes apart. Bank records revealed that $43,000 had been transferred from the HOA account to Karen's personal Chase Bank account on the exact same day she'd made the final payment on her Lexus SUV. This wasn't just about a power-hungry HOA president making life difficult for her neighbors. This was about a woman who had turned our community organization into her personal ATM machine, stealing nearly $1 million from 47 families who trusted her to manage their common interests. The parking incident in my garage wasn't random harassment. It was Karen testing the waters to see how much she could get away with, establishing precedents that would allow her to claim even more control over private property if she needed it. The first thing I did when I returned to Denver was establish my new daily routine. Every morning, I would spend 2 hours in my home office, which I'd converted into something resembling my old FinCEN workspace, complete with 3 monitors and filing cabinets that were rapidly filling with printed documentation of Karen's financial crimes. Within 2 weeks, I had compiled a dossier that would have made my old Treasury Department colleagues proud. Karen's embezzlement scheme was actually quite sophisticated, involving multiple layers of fake invoices, phantom contractors, and carefully timed money transfers designed to avoid automatic banking alerts. But building a case was only half the battle. I needed allies within the community, and I needed to be strategic about how I revealed what I'd discovered. My first recruit was Margaret Thompson, the retired accountant who'd been keeping me updated during my European vacation. When I showed her what I'd found, her professional instincts kicked in immediately. "Michael," she said, studying the spreadsheets I'd prepared, "this isn't just theft. This is organized, systematic embezzlement. We're talking about federal charges here." My second ally was David Miller, the real estate lawyer who'd been documenting Karen's attempts to break into my garage. When I showed him the evidence I'd compiled, his reaction was immediate and professional. "We need to be very careful about how we handle this. If we're going to take down a sitting HOA president for embezzlement, We need to make sure our case is absolutely bulletproof. Our strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of making accusations or demanding investigations, we would propose the creation of a financial transparency committee that would review all HOA expenditures and make recommendations for better fiscal oversight. It was the kind of proposal that no HOA president could oppose without looking suspicious, but it would give us the official authority to examine every transaction Karen had approved over the past 18 months. The monthly HOA meeting where I introduced this proposal was the first time I'd seen Karen face to face since the garage incident. She walked into the community center wearing her signature red HOA polo and white shorts, but I noticed that her usual confident demeanor had been replaced by something that looked like carefully controlled anxiety. When I stood up to address the room, I could see her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her gavel. As many of you know, our HOA fees have increased significantly over the past 18 months. I began, looking around the room at 43 of my neighbors. I think we owe it to ourselves to understand exactly how our money is being spent. I'd like to propose the formation of a financial transparency committee that would review our expenditures and make recommendations for improved oversight. The response was overwhelmingly positive. 34 residents voted in favor of the proposal, with only Karen and 2 of her close allies voting against it. Over the next month, our committee began examining every HOA transaction from the past 2 years. Karen was required by the community bylaws to provide us with complete financial records, but she began implementing a strategy of delay and obstruction that actually made our job easier. Every time she failed to produce requested documents or gave us incomplete information, it became more obvious that she was hiding something significant. The annual HOA meeting was scheduled for the first Sunday in October, and I knew it would be the most important community gathering in Wellington Heights history. Word had spread through the neighborhood about our Financial Transparency Committee's investigation, and 41 of our 47 households were represented, the highest attendance we'd ever recorded. The community center felt electric with tension as residents filed in, many carrying printed copies of the preliminary financial reports that Jennifer had distributed the week before. Karen arrived 15 minutes late, dressed in a black business suit instead of her usual red HOA polo shirt. I could see that she'd tried to project confidence and authority, but there was something desperate in her eyes as she surveyed the packed room. She'd clearly hoped that fewer people would show up, that she could control the narrative and dismiss our committee's findings as the complaints of a few disgruntled neighbors. Instead, she was facing a room full of people who'd been asking hard questions about where their money had gone. I know there have been some misunderstandings about how our HOA operates, Karen began, her voice carrying just the slightest tremor despite her attempts to sound authoritative. Today I'm going to clear up any confusion and explain exactly how we've been using your fees to improve and maintain our beautiful community. She clicked through a PowerPoint presentation that showed generic photos of landscaping and maintenance work, but she carefully avoided mentioning specific contractors or dollar amounts. Margaret Thompson was the first to raise her hand during the question period. As a retired accountant with 40 years of experience, Margaret commanded respect in our community, and her soft-spoken professionalism made her questions impossible to dismiss. Karen, I've been reviewing the financial records, and I'd like to understand the relationship between our HOA and Hendricks Home Services LLC. Can you explain why this company has received $847,000 in payments over the past 18 months? I watched Karen's face go pale as Margaret asked the question that we all knew was coming. That's proprietary information that doesn't need to be discussed in a public forum, Karen stammered, but her usual commanding presence had evaporated completely. These are routine maintenance contracts that were approved through proper channels. David Miller stood up next, and I could see Karen's shoulders tense as she recognized the threat he represented. As the only lawyer in our community, David's words carried enormous weight, and he'd prepared his remarks with the precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. With respect, Karen, I've examined the HOA bylaws, and there are no provisions for approving contracts without competitive bidding when the amounts exceed $5,000. I've also researched Hendricks Home Services, LLC, and I've discovered that it was registered on March 15th of last year, exactly 2 months after you became HOA president, and its business address is listed as your home address. The room erupted in whispers and murmurs as 41 residents processed what David had just revealed. Karen tried to maintain her composure, but I could see her hands shaking as she gripped the podium. That's just a coincidence with the name, she said weakly. I don't have any connection to that company. That's when I stood up for the first time during the meeting. I'd been waiting for this moment, and I wanted to make sure every word counted. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Peterson, and I live at 247 Oak Street. I'm also a member of the Financial Transparency Committee, and I have some additional information that I think everyone needs to hear. I connected my laptop to the community center's projection system and displayed the first slide of the presentation I'd spent weeks preparing. This is an email correspondence between karenhendricks@gmail.com and hendrickshome@gmail.com, I said, pointing to the screen where the two email addresses were clearly visible. As you can see, both emails originated from the same IP address and were sent 3 minutes apart. The content shows Karen Hendricks negotiating with herself about pricing for HOA maintenance services. The room fell completely silent as people absorbed the implications of what they were seeing. I clicked through slide after slide of evidence. Bank records showing transfers from the HOA account to Karen's personal checking account, invoices for work that was never performed, and photographs of the emergency repairs that had supposedly cost our community hundreds of thousands of dollars. With each new piece of evidence, I could see Karen shrinking smaller in her chair at the front of the room. The most damaging evidence came in slide 11, which showed a $43,000 transfer from the HOA account to Karen's personal Chase bank account on the exact same day she'd made her final payment on the Lexus SUV parked in her driveway. This particular transaction, I explained in the calm, professional tone I'd learned during my years at FinCEN, represents what's known in financial crime investigation as direct conversion, the immediate transfer of stolen funds to pay personal expenses. Karen finally broke. "Those documents, where did you get those?" she demanded, her voice rising to nearly a shout. "This is a violation of my privacy. You can't just spy on people's bank accounts." But Margaret Thompson was ready with the answer that destroyed Karen's last line of defense. "Karen, these documents were all obtained through proper legal channels or were provided to the Financial Transparency Committee as part of your responsibilities as HOA president. Everything we're showing here tonight is either public record or information you were required to provide to us." The final blow came when I displayed a photograph of Karen's Honda Civic parked in my garage, the incident that had started my investigation 3 months earlier. "This is where it all began," I told the packed room. Karen decided to park her car in my garage without permission, claiming she had the authority as HOA president to use any community property for emergencies. When I investigated her claim, I discovered that she'd been systematically stealing from every family in this neighborhood for 18 months. David Miller stood up and addressed the room with the formality of a courtroom proceeding. Based on the evidence presented by the Financial Transparency Committee, I move that we vote no confidence in Karen Hendricks as HOA president, effective immediately. The vote was unanimous, 40-0, with Karen abstaining. But David wasn't finished. I also move that we authorize legal counsel to pursue both civil and criminal charges against Ms. Hendricks for embezzlement and fraud. Karen finally stood up, her face flushed red with anger and humiliation. She reached into her purse and pulled out a set of car keys, which she placed on the table at the front of the room with a loud clatter. "Here are the keys to my Honda," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I'm sorry, Michael. I'm sorry to everyone." She walked out of the community center without another word, leaving behind a room full of neighbors who were just beginning to understand how thoroughly they'd been betrayed. As I watched Karen leave, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but the cost had been enormous. Not just the money she'd stolen, but the trust she'd destroyed within our community. I picked up her car keys from the table, finally holding the symbol of the parking dispute that had brought down an entire presidency. After 3 months, I'd won the war that started with a simple disagreement about where someone could park their car. 1 month after Karen's public confession and resignation, Wellington Heights was a very different place. Margaret Thompson had been elected as interim HOA president, and her first act was to hire a forensic accountant to determine exactly how much money Karen had stolen. The final tally was devastating. $934,000 had been embezzled over 18 months, with only $180,000 recoverable through the sale of Karen's house and luxury vehicles. The remaining $754,000 was simply gone, lost to credit card payments, mortgage payments, and living expenses that Karen could never repay. Our monthly HOA fees increased to $520 per household to cover the shortfall, and several families, particularly retirees on fixed incomes, were forced to consider selling their homes because they couldn't afford the new assessments. The Financial Crimes Unit of the Denver Police Department had taken over the investigation, and Karen was facing federal charges that could result in 5 to 10 years in prison. What had started as a neighborhood parking dispute had destroyed lives, broken trust, and fundamentally changed our community forever. But the most unexpected consequence of the entire saga came from a chance encounter at the grocery store 2 weeks after the annual meeting. I was picking up milk and bread when I ran into Jessica Hendricks, Karen's 16-year-old daughter, in the cereal aisle. Jessica had always been a quiet, studious kid who kept to herself, but the scandal had obviously taken a tremendous toll on her and her family. "Mr. Peterson," she said quietly, approaching me with the kind of nervous hesitation that broke my heart. "Do you know where my mom is staying now? She won't tell me, and I just want to understand why all of this happened." I stood there in that grocery store aisle, looking at this teenager whose life had been turned upside down by her mother's crimes and my investigation, and I realized that justice isn't always as clean and satisfying as we want it to be. I spent that night lying awake, thinking about the chain of events that had led us to this point. If Karen had simply apologized for parking in my garage and moved her car, would I have ever discovered her embezzlement scheme? Would she have eventually been caught by someone else? Or would she have continued stealing from our community until there was nothing left? I'd done the right thing by exposing her crimes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd also become something I didn't entirely recognize. Someone who'd enjoyed the process of systematically destroying another person, even if that person deserved it. The parallels between Karen and myself were uncomfortable to contemplate. She'd used her position as HOA president to take advantage of her neighbor's trust and steal money for her own benefit. I'd used my skills as a financial investigator to methodically expose her crimes and destroy her life. We'd both wielded power over other people, and we'd both justified our actions by telling ourselves we were doing what needed to be done. The main difference was that Karen had broken the law, while I'd simply been more effective at playing the game of power and control. David Miller and I had a long conversation about this moral complexity one evening as we walked through the neighborhood that had been forever changed by our investigation. "Do you think Karen could have been reformed if we'd confronted her privately first?" he asked, and I found myself unable to give him a definitive answer. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I do know that she'd stolen almost $1 million from our neighbors, including families who are now struggling to pay their mortgages because of the increased HOA fees. At some point, the consequences have to match the crime. Margaret Thompson offered me the position of permanent HOA president after her interim term ended, but I declined without hesitation. I'd seen what power could do to people, how it could corrupt someone like Karen, and how it could change someone like me into a person who enjoyed the process of bringing down his enemies. I didn't want to find out what kind of HOA president I might become if I had the authority to make decisions that affected 47 families' daily lives. Instead, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I put my house up for sale and began looking for a new place to live, somewhere I could start fresh without the constant reminders of the investigation and its aftermath. It wasn't that I regretted exposing Karen's crimes. I knew I'd done the right thing, but I also knew that I'd discovered something about myself that I needed to process away from Wellington Heights. The day before I moved out, I wrote a letter to Jessica Hendricks and left it in her family's mailbox. "Jessica," I wrote, "I want you to know that I'm sorry about how everything happened with your mother. She did steal money from our community, and she had to face the consequences of that choice. But I also realize that my investigation caused pain for innocent people like you. I hope you can learn from both of our mistakes, your mother's crime and my obsession with punishment, and find a way to build a life based on compassion rather than power." As I drove out of Wellington Heights for the last time, I found myself thinking about the Honda Civic that had started everything. Karen had used my garage without permission because she thought she could get away with it, because she assumed I was just another suburban neighbor who wouldn't fight back. But her assumption had been wrong, and that mistake had ultimately revealed a pattern of theft and fraud that might have continued for years if she'd simply chosen a different garage to commandeer. The most troubling question I carried with me as I left Wellington Heights wasn't whether I'd done the right thing. I knew I had, but whether I'd become the kind of person I wanted to be in the process. Karen had been brought to justice, our community had been protected from further theft, and the rule of law had been upheld. But I'd also discovered that I was capable of enjoying the systematic destruction of another human being, even when that destruction was legally and morally justified. 3 months earlier, I'd been a mild-mannered pharmaceutical company compliance officer who just wanted to park his car in his own garage. Now I was someone who'd brought down an embezzling HOA president and exposed nearly $1 million in fraud. The question that haunted me as I started my new life in a new neighborhood was this: which version of Michael Peterson was the real one? The quiet neighbor who minded his own business? Or the relentless investigator who'd methodically destroyed Karen Hendricks's life? And in my next community, which version would emerge when someone inevitably tested my boundaries again? Justice had been served, but the price of that justice was the uncomfortable realization that the line between hero and villain might be thinner than any of us want to admit. Karen's greatest crime wasn't just stealing money from her neighbors. It was forcing me to discover what I was capable of when someone pushed me too far. And that, perhaps, was the most lasting consequence of the day she decided to park her Honda Civic in my garage.